Summary of the poem. My Mother at 66 by Kamala Das. My Mother at 66 is a deeply emotional poem written by Kamala Das that reflects on the themes of aging, fear of loss, and the inevitable separation between a mother and her daughter. The poem is written in free verse, and its simplicity enhances its emotional depth. माई मदर 866 कमला दास द्वारा लिखी गई एक गहरी भावनात्मक कविता है जो उम्र बढ़ने, नुकसान के डर और एक माँ और उसकी बेटी के बीच अपरिहार्य अलगाव के विषयों को दर्शाती है। कविता मुक्त छंद में लिखी गई है और इसकी सादगी इसकी भावनात्मक गहराई को बढ़ाती है। The poem begins with the poet driving to the Cochin airport with her mother seated beside her. As she glances at her mother, she is struck by how frail and weak her mother has become. Her mother's face looks ashen like that of a corpse, symbolizing the impact of aging on her physical appearance. This triggers a deep sense of sorrow in the poet as she realizes how close her mother is to the end of her life. कविता की शुरुआत कवि द्वारा कोचीन हवाई अड्डे पर अपनी मां के साथ गाड़ी चलाने से होती है। जैसे ही वह अपनी मां को देखती है, वह इस बात से हैरान रह जाती है कि उसकी मां कितनी कमजोर और कमजोर हो गई है। उसकी मां का चेहरा एक लाश की तरह राख दिखता है, जो उसकी शारीरिक उपस्थिति पर उम्र बढ़ने के प्रभाव का प्रतीक है। यह कवि में दुख की गहरी भावना को ट्रिगर करता है क्योंकि उसे पता चलता है कि उसकी मां उसके जीवन के अंत के कितने करीब है। The poet's thoughts wander to her own childhood, recalling the fear of losing her mother that has haunted her since she was young. She describes this as a familiar ache, which resurfaces as she contemplates her mother's mortality. The fear of separation is deeply ingrained in the poet, and it intensifies as she observes her mother's deteriorating condition. कवि के विचार अपने बचपन में भटकते हैं, अपनी मां को खोने के डर को याद करते हुए जो उसे तब से परेशान करता है जब वह छोटी थी। वह इसे परिचित दर्द के रूप में वर्णित करती है, जो फिर से जीवित हो जाती है क्योंकि वह अपनी मां की मृत्यु दर पर विचार करती है। कवि में अलगाव का डर गहराई से समाया हुआ है और यह तेज हो जाता है क्योंकि वह अपनी मां की बिगड़ती स्थिति को देखती है। In an attempt to distract herself from these painful thoughts, the poet looks outside the car window. She sees vibrant, lively scenes of young trees sprinting and children spilling out of their homes, symbolizing the vitality and continuity of life. This contrast between the lively world outside and her mother's aging inside the car emphasizes the cycle of life and the inevitable decline that comes with age. इन दर्दनाक विचारों से खुद को विचलित करने के प्रयास में कवि कार की खिड़की के बाहर देखता है। वह युवा पेड़ों के जीवंत दृश्यों को दौड़ते हुए और बच्चों को अपने घरों से बाहर फैलते हुए देखती है, जो जीवन शक्ति और जीवन की निरंतरता का प्रतीक है। बाहर की जीवंत दुनिया और कार के अंदर उसकी मां की उम्र बढ़ने के बीच यह विपरीत जीवन के चक्र और उम्र के साथ आने वाली अपरिहार्य गिरावट पर जोर देता है। As they reach the airport and the poet prepares to say goodbye to her mother, she is filled with a sense of helplessness. She realizes that her mother is aging and that time is running out. However, instead of expressing her fears, she smiles and bids her mother a calm "see you soon." The repetition of smile and smile and smile at the end of the poem reveals the emotional conflict within the poet. She hides her deep anxiety behind a forced smile, trying to stay strong for her mother. जैसे ही वे हवाई अड्डे पर पहुंचते हैं और कवि अपनी मां को अलविदा कहने की तैयारी करता है, वह असहायता की भावना से भर जाती है। उसे पता चलता है कि उसकी मां बूढ़ी हो रही है और वह समय समाप्त हो रहा है। हालांकि अपने डर को व्यक्त करने के बजाय वह मुस्कुराती है और अपनी मां को शांत करने के लिए कहती है, जल्द ही मिलते हैं। कविता के अंत में मुस्कुराहट और मुस्कान की पुनरावृत्ति कवि के भीतर भावनात्मक संघर्ष को प्रकट करती है। वह अपनी गहरी चिंता को एक मजबूर मुस्कान के पीछे छुपाती है, अपनी मां के लिए मजबूत रहने की कोशिश करती है। मेन थीम्स: एजिंग एंड मॉर्टैलिटी. The poem deals with the inevitability of aging and the accompanying fear of death. The poet is painfully aware of her mother's frailty and impending mortality. उम्र बढ़ने और मृत्यु दर. कविता उम्र बढ़ने की अनिवार्यता और मृत्यु के भय से संबंधित है। कवि अपनी मां की दुर्बलता और आसन्न मृत्यु दर के बारे में दर्दनाक रूप से जानता है। Fear of separation. The poet's fear of being separated from her mother is a recurring theme. This fear, which she has carried since childhood, resurfaces when she observes her mother's declining health. अलगाव का डर. कवि का अपनी मां से अलग होने का डर एक आवर्ती विषय है। यह डर, जिसे वह बचपन से पाल रही है, जब वह अपनी मां के गिरते स्वास्थ्य को देखती है तो फिर से उभर आती है। Emotional conflict. The poet experiences an inner struggle between her deep love for her mother and her inability to openly express her sorrow. She masks her emotions with a smile, trying to stay composed in the face of impending loss. भावनात्मक संघर्ष. कवि अपनी मां के प्रति अपने गहरे प्रेम और खुले तौर पर अपने दुख को व्यक्त करने में असमर्थता के बीच एक आंतरिक संघर्ष का अनुभव करता है। वह अपनी भावनाओं को एक मुस्कान के साथ छिपाती है, आसन्न नुकसान के सामने बने रहने की कोशिश करती है। 1. Understanding the poem's theme. The poem My Mother at 66 by Kamala Das explores the universal theme of aging and the fear of losing loved ones. At its core, the poem is about the poet's deep emotional connection with her mother and her realization of the inevitable truth of mortality. कमला दास की कविता मेरी मां 66 पर उम्र बढ़ने के सार्वभौमिक विषय और प्रियजनों को खोने के डर की पड़ताल करती है। इसके मूल में कविता कवि के अपनी मां के साथ गहरे भावनात्मक संबंध और मृत्यु दर के अपरिहार्य सत्य की प्राप्ति के बारे में है। Key themes: aging and the fear of losing loved ones. Aging and mortality. उम्र बढ़ने और मृत्यु दर. The poem reflects the poet's pain and anxiety as she observes her mother's old age and frailty. The sight of her mother dozing off, with a pale and ashen face, reminds the poet of death. The theme of mortality runs throughout the poem as she confronts the possibility of losing her mother. कविता कवि के दर्द और चिंता को दर्शाती है क्योंकि वह अपनी मां के बुढ़ापे और दुर्बलता को देखती है। एक पीला और राख चेहरे के साथ उसकी मां की झपकी की दृष्टि कवि को मृत्यु की याद दिलाती है। मृत्यु दर का विषय पूरी कविता में चलता है क्योंकि वह अपनी मां को खोने की संभावना का सामना करती है। Fear of separation. The poem captures the poet's fear of losing her mother, a fear rooted in her childhood. The phrase familiar ache, my childhood's fear, shows that this fear has been with her for a long time, highlighting the deep bond between mother and daughter. कविता कवि के अपनी मां को खोने के डर को पकड़ती है, एक डर जो उसके बचपन में निहित है। वाक्यांश परिचित दर्द मेरे बचपन का डर से पता चलता है कि यह डर लंबे समय से उसके साथ रहा है, जो मां और बेटी के बीच गहरे बंधन को उजागर करता है। इमोशनल कॉन्फ्लिक्ट. There is an emotional conflict within the poet as she tries to suppress her feelings of sorrow and anxiety while putting on a brave face. This conflict is reflected when she smiles at her mother in the end, despite her inner turmoil. कवि के भीतर एक भावनात्मक संघर्ष है क्योंकि वह एक बहादुर चेहरे पर डालते हुए अपने दुख और चिंता की भावनाओं को दबाने की कोशिश करती है। यह संघर्ष तब परिलक्षित होता है जब वह अपनी आंतरिक उथल-पुथल के बावजूद अंत में अपनी मां पर मुस्कुराती है। नेचर एंड कॉन्ट्रास्ट। The poet contrasts her mother's aging with the youthful and lively scenes outside the car window, young trees sprinting, the merry children spilling out of their homes. This contrast emphasizes the passage of time and the difference between youth and old age. कवि कार की खिड़की के बाहर युवा और जीवंत दृश्यों के साथ अपनी मां की उम्र बढ़ने की तुलना करता है। युवा पेड़ दौड़ते हैं, हंसमुख बच्चे अपने घरों से बाहर निकलते हैं। यह विरोधाभास समय बीतने और युवाओं और बुढ़ापे के बीच के अंतर पर जोर देता है। मेन आइडिया। The poet expresses the inevitable reality of aging and death and the pain of separation from loved ones. Her mother's fragile health forces her to confront these difficult emotions, but she tries to mask her feelings with a smile as she leaves. कवि उम्र बढ़ने और मृत्यु की अपरिहार्य वास्तविकता और प्रियजनों से अलग होने के दर्द को व्यक्त करता है। उसकी मां का नाजुक स्वास्थ्य उसे इन कठिन भावनाओं का सामना करने के लिए मजबूर करता है, लेकिन वह अपनी भावनाओं को मुस्कुराहट के साथ मुखौटा करने की कोशिश करती है क्योंकि वह छोड़ देती है। The theme of the poem is deeply emotional, and it reflects Kamala Das's personal fear of losing her mother, which resonates with anyone who has experienced the pain of watching a loved one age. This theme is central to the poem and forms the basis for most of the questions you might encounter in exams. कविता का विषय गहरा भावनात्मक है और यह कमला दास के अपनी मां को खोने के व्यक्तिगत डर को दर्शाता है, जो किसी भी व्यक्ति के साथ प्रतिध्वनित होता है जिसने किसी प्रियजन को उम्र देखने के दर्द का अनुभव किया है। यह विषय कविता के केंद्र में है और परीक्षा में आपके सामने आने वाले अधिकांश प्रश्नों का आधार बनाता है। 2 line by line explanation of My Mother at 66 by Kamala Das. Let's break down each line of the poem to understand its meaning and significance. Line 1 to 2, driving from my parents' home to Cochin last Friday morning, I saw my mother, beside me, dozed, open-mouthed, her face ashen like that of a corpse, and realized with pain that she was as old as she looked. Explanation. The poet describes a recent personal experience when she was driving from her parents' home to Cochin. Her elderly mother is sitting beside her, dozing off with her mouth open, which is often associated with weakness or old age. The poet notices that her mother's face is pale, comparing it to a corpse, emphasizing the mother's fragile and weak condition, symbolizing the approach of death. The poet feels a sudden pain upon realizing that her mother looks exactly as old and frail as she is, which brings forth the reality of aging. Line 3 to 4, but soon put that thought away, and looked out at young trees sprinting, the merry children spilling out of their homes. Explanation. The poet tries to push aside her disturbing thoughts of her mother's mortality by distracting herself. She looks out of the car window and notices the opposite of her mother's aging, youth and life. The young trees sprinting represent the vitality and speed of life outside the car, while the merry children reflect the innocence and energy of youth. This contrast between her mother's old age and the vibrant scenes outside shows how life continues even as individuals age. Line 5, but after the airport's security check, standing a few yards away, I looked again at her van, pale as a late winter's moon, and felt that old familiar ache, my childhood's fear. Explanation. After going through the airport's security check, the poet looks back at her mother, who is now standing a few yards away. The mother's appearance is described as wan and pale as a late winter's moon, symbolizing her fading vitality. The winter moon is dull and lacks brightness, much like the frailty of old age. This triggers the poet's childhood fear, the fear of separation and losing her mother to death. This feeling has been with her since she was a child, reflecting how deeply she is emotionally connected to her mother. Line 6 to 7, but all I said was, "See you soon, Amma." All I did was smile and smile and smile. Explanation. Despite the deep emotional turmoil and fear of losing her mother, the poet doesn't express her true feelings. Instead, she says a simple goodbye, "See you soon, Amma," in an attempt to stay positive and not burden her mother with her worries. The repetition of smile shows that the poet forces herself to smile despite feeling emotional pain inside. This shows her attempt to mask her fear and sadness with a smile, keeping a brave face for her mother's sake. 3 literary devices and figures of speech in My Mother at 66 by Kamala Das. In this poem, Kamala Das skillfully uses literary devices to enhance the emotional depth and create vivid imagery. Understanding these devices will help you analyze the poem better and score higher in your exam. Here are the key literary devices. 1. Simile. A simile is a comparison between two things using the words like or as. Example, her face ashen like that of a corpse. Explanation, the poet compares her mother's pale, lifeless face to that of a corpse, emphasizing her mother's frailty and the poet's fear of her impending death. Example, pale as a late winter's moon. Explanation, the poet compares her mother's appearance to a late winter moon, which is dull and lacking in brightness, symbolizing the fading vitality of her mother as she ages. 2. Imagery. Imagery involves creating vivid pictures in the reader's mind through descriptive language. Example, young trees sprinting, the merry children spilling out of their homes. Explanation, the images of young, energetic trees and children playing represent vitality and life, in contrast to the mother's frailty. This emphasizes the stark difference between youth and old age. Example, her face ashen like that of a corpse. Explanation, the image of the mother's face being pale like a corpse paints a vivid picture of her fragile condition, evoking feelings of sorrow and fear. 3. Repetition. Repetition is the use of a word or phrase multiple times for emphasis. Example, smile and smile and smile. Explanation, the repetition of smile conveys the poet's emotional struggle as she forces herself to smile despite the inner turmoil she feels about her mother's condition. This shows her attempt to hide her pain and appear strong. 4. Contrast. Contrast highlights the differences between two opposing elements. Example, the contrast between the mother's aging and the energetic scenes outside the car, young trees sprinting, the merry children highlights the inevitability of aging and death, as well as the ongoing nature of life. Explanation, while the poet is focused on her mother's frailty, the world outside is full of life and youth, emphasizing the poet's anxiety about the passage of time. 5. Alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of the same consonant sound at the beginning of closely connected words. Example, my mother. Explanation, the repetition of the M sound creates a rhythmic effect, drawing attention to the close relationship between the poet and her mother. Example, smiled and smiled and smiled. Explanation, the repetition of the res sound here intensifies the emotional tension as the poet forces herself to smile repeatedly to mask her sadness. 6. Enjambment. Enjambment is the continuation of a sentence or thought without a pause beyond the end of a line. Example, I saw my mother, beside me, those, open-mouthed, her face ashen like that of a corpse. Explanation: the sentence flows beyond one line, reflecting the poet's continuous flow of thoughts and emotions, creating a natural and conversational tone. 7. Symbolism. Symbolism involves using symbols to signify ideas and qualities by giving them symbolic meanings different from their literal sense. Example: late winter's moon. Explanation: the winter moon symbolizes old age and the fading phase of life. Just like the moon, the mother's life is nearing its end, and her vitality is slowly diminishing. Summary of literary devices. The poem employs a variety of literary devices, including similes, imagery, repetition, contrast, and more, to evoke deep emotions and emphasize the themes of aging, separation, and the inevitability of death. These devices not only enhance the poem's emotional impact but also help the reader visualize and feel the poet's inner conflict. By understanding and being able to explain these literary devices, you will be able to write detailed answers for your CBSE board exams, significantly increasing your chances of scoring full marks. 4. Character sketch of the poet, Kamala Das in My Mother at 66. Kamala Das, a renowned Indian poet, explores themes of love, longing, identity, and relationships in her works. In My Mother at 66, she reflects on her personal emotions, especially her fear of losing her aging mother. Let's dive into the poet's personality and character as portrayed in this poem. A. Sensitive and emotional. Kamala Das is deeply sensitive and emotionally connected to her mother. The sight of her mother's frail appearance stirs feelings of pain and sorrow within her. She is acutely aware of her mother's aging and is emotionally affected by the thought of her mother's inevitable mortality. Example: the poet compares her mother's face to that of a corpse, reflecting her emotional pain as she confronts the reality of her mother's old age and frailty. B. Fearful of separation. Throughout the poem, Kamala Das expresses a strong fear of separation from her mother. She has carried this fear since childhood, which shows how deeply ingrained this anxiety is in her psyche. Example: the line "that old familiar ache, my childhood's fear" indicates that the poet has long been afraid of losing her mother, a fear that resurfaces strongly in this moment. C. Compassionate and caring. Kamala Das's deep care and concern for her mother are evident in the way she observes her mother's appearance and feels pain at seeing her so frail. Her sensitivity toward her mother's condition reflects her compassionate nature. Example: her quiet observation of her mother's ashen face and her inner emotional turmoil show the deep love and care she has for her. D. Strong yet vulnerable. While Kamala Das is deeply emotional and vulnerable on the inside, she tries to maintain a composed and strong exterior. She does not openly express her fears and anxieties to her mother but instead smiles and bids her goodbye with reassuring words. Example: the line "all I did was smile and smile and smile" reveals that the poet is trying to suppress her true feelings and present a brave front, even though she is internally distressed. E. Introspective. Kamala Das is reflective and introspective, as the poem takes the reader through her inner thoughts and emotions. She is keenly aware of the passage of time and the inevitability of death, which causes her to reflect on her relationship with her mother. Example: the entire poem is an internal monologue, with the poet reflecting on her fears and emotions while observing her mother. F. Attached to her mother. The poem reflects the deep bond and attachment Kamala Das has with her mother. Her strong emotional reaction to her mother's aging shows the special place her mother holds in her life. Example, the fear of losing her mother is something she has carried since childhood, indicating that her mother has always been a central figure in her life. 5 important quotes and explanations from My Mother at 66. Here are some key quotes from the poem that are crucial for understanding its themes, emotions, and literary significance, along with their explanations. Quote 1. Her face ashen like that of a corpse. Explanation. This simile compares the poet's mother's face to a corpse, highlighting her frailty and pale appearance. The imagery of death is introduced here, and it reflects the poet's realization that her mother is nearing the end of her life. The use of ashen emphasizes the lifelessness in her mother's face, symbolizing the reality of aging and mortality. Quote 2. I looked again at her, wan, pale as a late winter's moon. Explanation. The poet compares her mother to the late winter's moon, which symbolizes something that has lost its brightness and vitality. Just like the winter moon appears pale and distant, her mother's health is fading, making the poet feel sorrowful. This metaphor captures the inevitability of old age, while the comparison to the moon underscores the cyclical nature of life. Quote 3. Felt that old familiar ache, my childhood's fear. Explanation. This line refers to the poet's deep-rooted fear of losing her mother, a fear that dates back to her childhood. The phrase familiar ache reveals how this fear has been a constant part of her life. The poet expresses a universal emotion, the fear of separation from a loved one, particularly a parent. It also highlights the poet's vulnerability and attachment to her mother. Quote 4. But all I said was, see you soon, Amma. Explanation. Despite the overwhelming emotions inside her, the poet doesn't express her true feelings. Instead, she keeps it simple, telling her mother, see you soon, showing her effort to remain positive and calm. This quote reveals the poet's emotional restraint as she hides her fear and sadness behind a polite farewell, trying not to burden her mother with her own distress. Quote 5. All I did was smile and smile and smile. Explanation. The repetition of smile shows the poet's internal conflict. Even though she is deeply affected by the sight of her mother's frailty, she forces herself to smile, suppressing her true emotions. This repetition emphasizes the tension between her external composure and her inner turmoil. It highlights the poet's attempt to hide her anxiety and fear about her mother's health and mortality. Quote 6. Young trees sprinting, the merry children spilling out of their homes. Explanation. The poet contrasts the lively, youthful scenes outside the car with her mother's aging. The young trees sprinting and merry children symbolize vitality, energy, and the continuity of life. This contrast sharpens the poet's awareness of her mother's old age and the natural cycle of life, where youth and old age coexist. It also emphasizes the unstoppable passage of time. 6 CBSE Exam Pattern Questions for My Mother at 66 by Kamala Das. A. Multiple choice questions, MCQs. What did the poet notice about her mother while driving to the airport? She was sleeping soundly. Her face looked ashen like a corpse. She was excited about the journey. She was talking happily. Answer B. Her face looked ashen like a corpse. The simile as a late winter's moon refers to the poet's mother's enthusiasm, fading vitality, bright personality, childlike energy. Answer B. Fading vitality. What was the familiar ache the poet felt? Physical pain. Fear of separation from her mother. Excitement of traveling. Happiness of seeing her mother. Answer B. Fear of separation from her mother. Where was the poet's mother sitting in the car? Beside the driver. At the back seat. Beside the poet. In the front seat. Answer C. Beside the poet. Which of the following is not a symbol in the poem? Sprinting trees. Coats-like face. Winter's moon. The sun. Answer D. The sun. What emotion does the poet feel when she looks at her mother's face? Joy. Sorrow. Anger. Indifference. Answer B. Sorrow. Why does the poet compare her mother's face to a corpse? To show her mother is sick. To highlight her mother's lifeless and pale appearance due to old age. To show her mother's sadness. To express her mother's anger. Answer B. To highlight her mother's lifeless and pale appearance due to old age. What does the poet see outside the car window that contrasts with her mother's condition? Busy streets. Sprinting trees and merry children. Dark clouds. A funeral procession. Answer B. Sprinting trees and merry children. The phrase late winter's moon refers to the coldness of winter, the pale and weak appearance of the mother, the time of the year, the beauty of nature. Answer B. The pale and weak appearance of the mother. What does the poet's parting smile symbolize in the poem? Her happiness. Her fear and attempt to hide her emotions. Her indifference. Her excitement for the trip. Answer B. Her fear and attempt to hide her emotions. What does the poet's familiar ache refer to? A recurring illness. Her fear of losing her mother. A physical injury. Her fear of traveling. Answer B. Her fear of losing her mother. In the poem, what does the phrase "see you soon, Amma" reflect about the poet? Her casual goodbye. Her attempt to reassure herself and her mother. Her excitement to meet her mother again. Her indifference towards her mother. Answer B. Her attempt to reassure herself and her mother. Why does the poet focus on sprinting trees and merry children? To describe the scenery. To show the vitality and energy of youth, in contrast to her mother's aging. To express her happiness. To distract from her mother's condition. Answer B. To show the vitality and energy of youth, in contrast to her mother's aging. B. Short answer questions sucks. What is the significance of the title My Mother at 66? Answer. The title reflects the poet's realization of her mother's advancing age and frailty. At 66, the mother represents the inevitable process of aging, symbolizing the poet's fear of losing her. The poem captures the poet's emotional turmoil as she confronts the reality of her mother's mortality. How does Kamala Das use imagery in the poem to convey her emotions? Answer. Kamala Das uses vivid imagery, such as comparing her mother's face to that of a corpse and the late winter's moon, to highlight her mother's frail condition and fading vitality. The contrasting images of sprinting trees and merry children symbolize life's energy and youth, which contrast with the poet's mother's aging, emphasizing the inevitability of time passing. What is the poet's childhood fear mentioned in the poem? Answer. The poet's childhood fear is the fear of separation from her mother. This fear resurfaces when she sees her mother's pale and aging face, reminding her of the impending loss and the harsh reality of death. Why does the poet smile and smile in the end? Answer: the poet smiles to mask her inner fear and sadness about her mother's frailty and mortality. The repetition of smile shows her emotional struggle as she forces herself to appear cheerful and calm despite being deeply troubled by the thought of losing her mother. See long answer questions, LAQs. Describe how Kamala Das brings out the theme of aging and fear of loss in My Mother at 66. Answer: in the poem My Mother at 66, Kamala Das explores the theme of aging through the lens of her relationship with her mother. The sight of her mother's pale, ashen face sparks a deep emotional reaction in the poet, who is reminded of her childhood fear of losing her mother. This fear of separation is central to the poem, as the poet confronts the reality of her mother's aging and the inevitable passage of time. The imagery of a corpse-like face and the late winter's moon highlights the mother's declining health, while the contrasting images of youthful energy outside the car, like sprinting trees and merry children, emphasize the poet's awareness of life's cyclical nature. The poem captures the universality of loss and the emotional conflict between love, fear, and the acceptance of mortality. Analyze the use of contrast in the poem My Mother at 66 to convey the poet's emotions. Answer: Kamala Das effectively uses contrast to emphasize the emotional depth of the poem. Inside the car, the poet is absorbed by her mother's fragile and aging appearance, which is symbolized by the simile comparing her face to a corpse. This evokes a sense of fear and impending loss. Outside the car, however, the poet sees young trees sprinting and merry children spilling out of their homes, which symbolize vitality, youth, and the continuity of life. This stark contrast between the youthful energy outside and the poet's mother's frailty inside highlights the poet's emotional turmoil. The contrast not only reinforces the theme of aging and mortality, but also shows the poet's inner conflict between her love for her mother and her fear of losing her. Explain how Kamala Das portrays the theme of separation in the poem. Answer: the theme of separation is central to Kamala Das's My Mother at 66. The poem reflects the poet's fear of being separated from her aging mother, a fear she has harbored since childhood. When she observes her mother's frail, corpse-like appearance, the poet is struck by the thought that her mother might not be with her much longer. This realization evokes a familiar ache in the poet, a reminder of the fear of loss that has haunted her for years. Despite this, the poet maintains a brave front, saying a calm "see you soon" and smiling repeatedly to conceal her sadness. The inevitable separation between the poet and her mother, whether by distance or death, permeates the poem, making it a poignant reflection on the fragility of human relationships. The poem My Mother at 66 explores the poet's emotional conflict as she faces the inevitable reality of her mother's aging. Discuss the poem in light of this statement. Answer: the poem My Mother at 66 by Kamala Das portrays the emotional conflict the poet experiences as she confronts her mother's advancing age and fragility. The sight of her mother's pale, lifeless face immediately triggers a wave of sorrow and fear within her. The simile comparing her mother's face to a corpse indicates the poet's realization that her mother is nearing the end of her life. This brings to the surface the poet's deep-rooted fear of losing her mother, a fear she has harbored since childhood. To escape these unsettling thoughts, the poet turns her attention to the scenery outside the car, young trees sprinting and children playing merrily. This contrast between the vitality of youth and the frailty of her mother reinforces the theme of aging and the inevitable passage of time. The poet's emotional conflict becomes more pronounced as she struggles to maintain composure. Despite her inner turmoil, she says goodbye to her mother with a forced smile, repeating the word smile to highlight the emotional burden she carries. The poem beautifully captures the universal fear of separation from loved ones, especially parents, and reflects on the inevitability of death. The poet's conflicting emotions, love, fear, and helplessness, are conveyed with subtlety, making the poem resonate with readers who have experienced similar fears. Analyze the significance of imagery in Kamala Das's My Mother at 66. How does the poet use imagery to highlight the theme of aging and mortality? Answer. Kamala Das effectively uses imagery in My Mother at 66 to emphasize the themes of aging and mortality. The poem opens with a vivid image of the poet's mother sitting beside her face ashen like that of a corpse. This comparison immediately establishes the sense of aging and impending death. The use of the word ashen suggests lifelessness, symbolizing the frailty and decline of the poet's mother. Another powerful image is the comparison of the mother's face to a late winter's moon. The moon in winter is pale, distant, and devoid of its usual brightness, much like the poet's mother, who has lost the vitality of youth. This metaphor underscores the theme of mortality, as winter often symbolizes the latter stages of life. In contrast, the poet describes the outside world with vibrant, energetic imagery, trees sprinting and merry children spilling out of their homes. These images represent life, youth, and the continuity of time, contrasting sharply with the poet's mother's weakened state. The juxtaposition of these two contrasting images reinforces the poet's realization that while life continues around her, her mother's life is slowly fading. The imagery in the poem highlights the emotional weight the poet carries as she contemplates her mother's mortality. Through these visual contrasts, the poet not only conveys her personal sorrow but also touches on the universal experience of witnessing a loved one grow old and face the inevitable end of life. Discuss how Kamala Das expresses the theme of fear and helplessness in the poem My Mother at 66. Answer. In My Mother at 66, Kamala Das powerfully expresses the themes of fear and helplessness as she confronts her mother's aging and impending mortality. The poet's fear stems from the realization that her mother is growing old and may not live much longer. This fear is introduced early in the poem when the poet compares her mother's face to that of a corpse, emphasizing the mother's frailty and the proximity of death. As the poem progresses, the poet reflects on her familiar ache, a childhood fear of losing her mother that resurfaces when she sees her mother's aged appearance. This phrase captures the sense of helplessness the poet feels, an emotion that has been with her since she was young. Despite this fear, the poet knows there is nothing she can do to stop the inevitable process of aging, which only intensifies her feelings of helplessness. When the poet looks outside the car, she sees symbols of life and vitality, the sprinting trees and merry children that stand in stark contrast to her mother's condition. This contrast further deepens the poet's awareness of her mother's declining health and her own inability to change the situation. The poem ends with the poet forcing a smile as she says goodbye to her mother. The repetition of smile and smile and smile illustrates her struggle to hide her fear and sadness. She is unable to express her true emotions, masking her helplessness with a forced sense of calm. Through this emotional restraint, the poet highlights the painful reality of watching a loved one age, knowing that separation is inevitable.